The phone's harsh ring cut through the peaceful silence of my corner office on the 35th floor. I glanced at the caller ID, surprised to see Richard's name flashing across the screen at 10:30 in the morning. My husband rarely called during work hours, especially not when he knew I was preparing for a major corporate merger case. Something was wrong. The moment I heard his voice, cold, distant, almost mechanical, I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind of premonition that makes your stomach clench before the bad news even arrives. "Alexandra, this isn't working anymore. I want a divorce," he said without preamble, without even a hello. 13 years of marriage dismissed in 8 words, delivered with all the emotion of someone ordering coffee. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white as I tried to process what I was hearing. The Manhattan skyline stretched out beyond my office window, unchanged, indifferent to the fact that my world was crumbling. "Richard, what are you talking about? Is this some kind of joke?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too high, too breathless. I stood up, nearly knocking over the crystal paperweight he'd given me for our 10th anniversary. It caught the morning light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the stacks of legal briefs on my mahogany desk. "It's not a joke, Alexandra. I've already moved most of my things out. Martin Goldstein will handle the details from here. Don't try to contact me directly. All communication goes through him." The finality in his voice stunned me. There was no room for discussion, no explanation offered. "You can't just end our marriage over the phone. Richard, we need to talk about this face-to-face," I pleaded, hating the desperation creeping into my voice. I was Alexandra Montgomery, the attorney who made corporate executives squirm during depositions. I didn't beg. Yet here I was, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "There's nothing to discuss. I've made my decision." A brief pause. Then, "You've changed, Alexandra. We both have. It's better this way." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing there staring at my reflection in the window glass. A successful woman in a tailored suit, looking utterly lost. My assistant Sarah's concerned face appeared at my door. "Alex? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She'd been with me for 6 years, long enough to read the subtle shifts in my expression. I motioned for her to close the door. "Richard just called. He wants a divorce." Saying the words out loud made them more real, more painful. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "What? Why? You two seemed fine at the firm's Christmas party last month." She crossed the room and took the seat across from my desk. I sank back into my leather chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. Apparently not. I massaged my temples, trying to make sense of it all. He told me not to contact him. Said everything needs to go through his lawyer, Martin Goldstein. Sarah's expression shifted from shock to indignation. "Goldstein? That shark from Perkins and Gray? Richard's planning to play hardball right out of the gate." She leaned forward. "Alex, you need to take this seriously. Goldstein doesn't mess around." I nodded, my mind already shifting gears, years of legal training kicking in despite the emotional earthquake. I know exactly who Martin Goldstein is. He's represented 3 of Richard's restaurant acquisitions. A thought struck me. But he's never handled a divorce case as far as I know. He's strictly corporate. Maybe Richard thinks having a corporate attorney will intimidate you into accepting whatever terms they offer, Sarah suggested, her loyalty evident in the fierce protectiveness of her tone. Perhaps. I opened my laptop, typing quickly. Or maybe Richard doesn't realize that his wife has spent the last decade becoming one of the top contract attorneys in this city. The irony wasn't lost on me. When we first met, I was a 20-year-old receptionist at an advertising agency where Richard's restaurant was a client. He was 31, already successful, confident, and utterly charming. I had been dazzled by him, by the world he introduced me to. I remembered how proud he'd been when I decided to go to law school, how he'd boasted to his friends about his brilliant wife. "My Alexandra is going to be a force to be reckoned with," he'd say, his arm around my waist. Apparently, He hadn't considered what that might mean if we ever ended up on opposite sides. "I'm going to need to clear my calendar for the next few days," I told Sarah, already mentally reorganizing my caseload. "Call Thomas and see if he can take the lead on the Westlake merger. And find out everything you can about Richard's recent activities, business transactions, travel records, anything unusual in the last 6 months." Sarah nodded, already making notes. "What about your meeting with the Clayton Industries Board this afternoon?" "Reschedule. Family emergency." The words tasted bitter. "And Sarah?" Not a word about this to anyone in the office yet. After she left, I sat motionless, staring at the framed photo on my desk. Richard and me on our 10th anniversary trip to Bali, both of us smiling on a pristine beach. I tried to reconcile that image with the cold voice on the phone this morning. What had changed? When had it changed? I thought back over the past few months, searching for warning signs I might have missed. There had been subtle shifts. More late nights at the office for both of us, fewer shared meals, conversations that stayed on the surface of our lives rather than delving deeper, but nothing that screamed impending divorce. Richard had seemed more distant lately, yes, but I'd attributed that to stress over the opening of his newest restaurant location. I pulled up our shared calendar on my phone, scrolling back through the last 6 months. Richard's business trips had increased from the usual once a month to nearly every other weekend. There were dinner meetings that ran unusually late, gym sessions at odd hours. Looking at the pattern now, with fresh eyes, it was obvious. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Richard was seeing someone else. The tears came then, hot and unexpected. I hadn't cried in years, not since my father's funeral. I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes, setting the timer on my phone. 5 minutes to feel the hurt, the betrayal, the humiliation. Then I dried my eyes, reapplied my makeup, and did what I'd been trained to do. I started gathering information. By noon, I had accessed our joint accounts and discovered several interesting charges. Hotel rooms in the city. Why would he need a hotel when we had a penthouse 15 minutes away? Expensive jewelry purchases from Tiffany that I'd never received. Dinners at intimate restaurants on nights he'd told me he was working late. The evidence mounted. Each new discovery like another cut. The most damning proof came when I checked our cell phone account. Richard had a second line I didn't recognize, with hundreds of texts and calls to the same number. I couldn't access the content of the messages. I wasn't that kind of lawyer, but the pattern was clear enough. I was about to call Goldstein's office when my phone pinged with an email notification. It was from Martin Goldstein himself, requesting a meeting tomorrow afternoon to discuss the terms of your separation agreement. Attached was a document outlining a proposed settlement that made my blood boil. Richard was offering me our city apartment and a modest monthly alimony for 5 years. In exchange, I would relinquish all claims to his business holdings, which constituted the vast majority of our marital assets. It was insulting, not just financially, but personally. After 13 years, after I'd supported him through the early struggles of his business, after I'd helped review every contract for his restaurant expansions, this was what he thought I deserved. I smiled for the first time that day. A dangerous smile that would have warned anyone who knew me well to tread carefully. Richard had forgotten something crucial. Before becoming his wife, I'd signed a prenuptial agreement. An agreement that I, as a naive 20-year-old, hadn't fully understood, but one that I, as a 33-year-old contract attorney now knew, contained a very interesting infidelity clause. I replied to Goldstein's email, accepting the meeting but suggesting his office rather than the neutral location he'd proposed. Then I began my own preparations, starting with a call to our bank to freeze the transfers Richard had initiated that morning from our joint investment account. That evening, I returned to our penthouse for the first time since Richard's call. The space felt different now, emptier, despite the minimal evidence of Richard's departure. His favorite watch was missing from the bedside table, some clothes gone from the closet, his laptop no longer on his desk, But he'd left most of his possessions, confident, perhaps, that he'd be returning for them soon. I walked through each room slowly, seeing our shared life with new eyes. Photos from vacations and celebrations lined the hallway, visual markers of a relationship I thought would last forever. Had he been unhappy all this time? Or was this something new, a midlife crisis wrapped in the fresh excitement of a younger woman? In his home office, I found what I was looking for, a small safe hidden behind a painting, its combination unchanged from the day we'd bought it, the date we met. Inside were various documents, including our prenuptial agreement. I removed it carefully, sat at his desk, and began to read. The language was formal, legalistic, but the relevant clause was clear. In the event that either party engages in provable infidelity, the aggrieved spouse shall be entitled to 50% of the offending spouse's business assets acquired during the marriage, in addition to standard division of marital property. Richard had insisted on this clause, convinced that a young wife would eventually stray. The memory of his patronizing smile as he'd explained it made anger flare hot in my chest. It's just protection, Alexandra, for both of us. But we both knew it had been about his insecurity, his fear that a 20-year-old would eventually be tempted by someone her own age. The irony was almost poetic. The very clause he'd created to protect himself would now be his undoing. I slept in the guest room that night, unable to face our bed. Before turning out the light, I sent a text to the mystery number from Richard's secret phone. We need to talk about Richard. Then I switched off my phone and slept more soundly than I had any right to. The next morning, I dressed with deliberate care. A sharp charcoal suit that Richard had always said made me look intimidating. Emerald earrings that matched my eyes, my grandmother's vintage watch for luck. I gathered the documents I'd need, including the prenuptial agreement and evidence of Richard's affair, and placed them in my briefcase. Then I headed to Martin Goldstein's office, ready for the confrontation that would determine my future. Goldstein's assistant looked surprised when I gave my name. "Oh, Mrs. Montgomery, we weren't expecting you until 3 this afternoon." "I decided to come early," I said, with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Is Martin available now? It's rather urgent." She hesitated, then picked up her phone, murmuring into it too quietly for me to hear. After a moment, she nodded. "He can see you now. Follow me, please." As I walked into Martin Goldstein's corner office, I saw him rising from behind his desk, hand extended in greeting. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for ruthlessness that belied his mild appearance. "Mrs. Montgomery, I presume? I'm Martin Goldstein." His tone was professional but tinged with something like pity. "Yes, I'm the wife," I confirmed, setting my briefcase on his desk with a decisive click. The moment I spoke those words, something shifted in Goldstein's expression. He paled slightly, his extended hand frozen in midair as recognition dawned. "You're Alexandra Montgomery, from Montgomery and Jenkins." His voice had changed, the confidence replaced by uncertainty. I smiled, extending my own hand now. "That's right. I believe you and I negotiated opposite sides of the Eastbrook Plaza development last year. Small world, isn't it?" Martin Goldstein, one of the most feared corporate attorneys in the city, visibly swallowed. His hand trembled slightly as he shook mine, and I knew in that moment that I had the upper hand. Richard had made a critical error. He'd forgotten that his wife wasn't just any woman. She was an attorney who specialized in the very contracts he was trying to use against her. Goldstein gestured for me to take a seat, his movements stiff as he returned to his own chair. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him showcased the Manhattan skyline, but his view today was of a woman he suddenly realized was not the pushover client he'd anticipated. "I must say, Mrs. Montgomery." "Ms. Montgomery will do," I interrupted, keeping my tone pleasant but firm. "Or Alexandra, if you prefer. We're colleagues, after all." He nodded, recalibrating. "Alexandra, then. This is unexpected. Richard didn't mention your professional standing." I imagine there are many things Richard failed to mention. I opened my briefcase and removed a folder, placing it carefully on the polished surface of his desk, including the precise terms of our prenuptial agreement. Goldstein's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "I have a copy of the agreement here," he said, tapping a blue folder to his right. "I'm sure you do. But I wonder if Richard directed your attention to Section 7, Paragraph 3. I slid my copy across the desk, opened to the relevant page, with the infidelity clause highlighted in bright yellow. As Goldstein read, I watched his face cycle through confusion, realization, and finally, alarm. He looked up at me, then back down at the document, as though hoping the words might have changed in the interim. "This is quite specific," he said finally. "Yes, it is." Richard was very insistent about that clause when we married. He was concerned that a young wife might be tempted to stray. I smiled thinly. "Ironic, isn't it?" Goldstein removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Alexandra, I'm sure we can come to a reasonable arrangement without invoking—" "I've brought evidence," I cut in smoothly, placing a second folder on the desk. "Credit card statements, hotel receipts, phone records, and this morning I received a very interesting text response from a number that has been communicating with my husband quite regularly." I took out my phone and placed it face up on the desk, displaying the message that had greeted me when I woke up. "Who is this?" "Richard gave me this number to contact him. I'm Brittany." Goldstein stared at the phone, then at the evidence folder, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting. I need to consult with my client." "By all means," I said, reclaiming my phone but leaving the folders. "I'll wait." "That's not necessary. I can call you when—" "I'll wait," I repeated, more firmly this time. I settled back in my chair, crossing my legs. "This won't take long." Goldstein hesitated, then nodded curtly and picked up his phone. He turned slightly away from me as he dialed, but I could still hear his side of the conversation. "Richard, we need to talk. Now." A pause. "No, it can't wait." Another pause, longer this time. "Your wife is here." "Yes, in my office." He listened for a moment, his expression darkening. "Richard, did you ever actually read your prenuptial agreement? The one you insisted on?" The response must have been negative, because Goldstein closed his eyes briefly. "There's an infidelity clause. 50% of business assets acquired during marriage." Even from across the desk, I could hear Richard's explosive reaction. Goldstein held the phone away from his ear for a moment before responding, "Yes, she has evidence. Quite a lot of it, from what I can see." Another pause. "That's not how this works, Richard. You can't just—" He frowned. "She's a contracts attorney. Did you know that?" A longer silence. "I see. Well, that complicates things significantly." When he finally hung up, Goldstein looked at me with something approaching respect. "Richard is on his way. He'd like to discuss this privately." I'm sure he would. I reclaimed my evidence folders and returned them to my briefcase. Unfortunately for him, that's not how this works anymore. All communication goes through you, remember? His words, not mine. "Alexandra, be reasonable. 13 years of marriage deserves a conversation at least." 13 years of marriage deserved better than a phone call ending it, I countered, feeling a flash of the hurt I'd suppressed beneath my professional demeanor. Richard made his choice. Now he can live with the consequences. We sat in uncomfortable silence for nearly 20 minutes before Richard burst through the door, his normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled. He stopped short when he saw me, as though surprised to find me actually there. His eyes, the warm brown that had once made my heart race, were cold and wary now. "Alexandra," just my name, flat and emotionless. "Richard." I remained seated, refusing to be rattled by his presence. He turned to Goldstein. "Give us the room." The attorney looked relieved to escape and quickly gathered some papers. "I'll be in the conference room when you're ready." Once we were alone, Richard paced to the window, his back to me. This is low, even for an attorney, using a technicality to try to take half my business. A technicality? I repeated, incredulous. You mean the clause that you insisted on? The one designed to protect you from me? He turned, his expression hard. That was different. How? Because you never imagined I'd be the one enforcing it? I leaned forward. Or because you didn't think I'd find out about Brittany? His eyes widened slightly at the name, confirming what I already knew. How did you? It doesn't matter. What matters is that you broke our contract, Richard. Both the marriage and the legal agreement that came with it. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked dark hair, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache despite everything. Look, I know this is a shock. I handled it badly. But we can be reasonable about this. Reasonable, I echoed. Like serving divorce papers through your attorney? Or emptying our joint investment account without discussion? That kind of reasonable. I was angry, he admitted, moving to sit in Goldstein's chair. You've been so focused on your career these past few years. Always working late, always distracted. We barely talk anymore. I stared at him, stunned by the hypocrisy. Are you seriously trying to blame me for your affair? It's not that simple. He leaned forward, his expression softening into the charming smile that had once made me weak at the knees. Alex, honey, we've grown apart. These things happen. But we can end this amicably. The settlement offer is generous. Generous? I cut him off, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. 20% of what I'm legally entitled to is not generous, Richard. It's insulting. The prenup was never meant to be used like this, he argued, frustration bleeding into his tone. It was just a formality. Then you shouldn't have insisted on it. I stood, gathering my briefcase. Or you shouldn't have cheated. Either way, we're beyond negotiating directly. As you said, all communication through the attorneys from now on. Richard stood too, his height allowing him to tower over me, an intimidation tactic he'd used in the past when arguments weren't going his way. Don't do this, Alexandra. You'll regret it. I held my ground, looking up at him steadily. No, Richard. You'll regret assuming I was still that naive 20-year-old who didn't understand what she was signing. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. Wait, just wait! His voice had lost its edge, sounding almost pleading. What do you want? Just tell me what you want, and we can make this go away. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine saying what I truly wanted, for none of this to be happening, for the man I'd loved for 13 years not to have betrayed me, for the life we'd built together not to be crumbling. But that wasn't possible anymore. I want what I'm entitled to under the agreement you created, I said instead, gently removing his hand from my arm. 50% of the business assets acquired during our marriage, and an equitable division of our personal property. That would cripple the restaurant group, he protested. We're in the middle of an expansion. The new locations in Chicago and Boston should have been considerations before you decided to sleep with a 22-year-old hostess. I finished for him, watching his face pale at the accuracy of my information. How did you think this would end, Richard? Did you really believe I'd just accept whatever scraps you offered and disappear quietly? The door opened before he could respond, and Goldstein returned, looking uncomfortable. I thought I heard raised voices. Is everything all right? Perfect timing, I said, moving toward the door. We're finished here. Richard has some decisions to make, and I have a deposition at 2 o'clock. I paused at the threshold. I'll expect a revised settlement offer by the end of the week, Mr. Goldstein. One that reflects the terms of our prenuptial agreement in full. I left without looking back, maintaining my composure until I reached the privacy of the elevator. Only then did I allow my shoulders to slump, my carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of what had just transpired. The Richard I thought I knew, the man who had encouraged my education, celebrated my successes, built a life with me, was gone, if he had ever existed at all. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. How did it go? Do you need backup? I smiled faintly at her loyalty. Meeting over. Coming back to the office. Will fill you in. When I returned to my firm, I found Thomas Jenkins waiting in my office, his distinguished face creased with concern. In his late 50s, Thomas had been my mentor since law school, the one who had encouraged me to specialize in contract law and had eventually made me partner at his firm. "Sarah told me what happened," he said, rising as I entered. "I'm so sorry, Alexandra." I set down my briefcase and sank into my chair, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you. It's been an educational 24 hours. Do you need representation? I know someone excellent in family law." "I can handle it," I interrupted, then softened my tone. "But thank you. I appreciate the offer." Thomas studied me for a moment. "This isn't just another case, Alex. It's your marriage, your life. Having emotional distance might be beneficial." I shook my head. "Richard made this about business when he tried to cheat me out of what I'm entitled to. I won't let personal feelings interfere with getting a fair settlement." "And after?" Thomas asked gently. "When the papers are signed and the assets divided? What then?" It was a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider yet. After 13 years with Richard, who was I on my own? What would my life look like without him in it? "I don't know," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. "I guess I'll figure that out when I get there." Thomas nodded, patting my shoulder as he stood to leave. "You're stronger than you think, Alexandra. You always have been." At the door, he paused. "Take the rest of the day. The Westlake merger can wait." Once alone, I found myself staring at the wedding photo on my desk, the one I'd kept there as a reminder of where I'd come from, and the person who had believed in me when I was just starting out. I picked it up, tracing Richard's smiling face with my finger. Had he ever really loved me? Or had I simply been a young, impressionable trophy to display at business functions? My thoughts were interrupted by another text message, this one from an unknown number. "This is Brittany. Can we meet? There's something you should know about Richard." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. This was Richard's mistress, the woman who had helped destroy my marriage, reaching out directly. My first instinct was to ignore it. What could she possibly have to say that I would want to hear? But the lawyer in me recognized potential information, leverage I might need. After a long moment, I typed back, "The Atrium Cafe, tomorrow, noon." That night, I returned to our penthouse and began the painful process of separating my life from Richard's. I moved his remaining clothes to the guest room, deleted our shared playlists, and removed his emergency contact information from my phone. Each action was like cutting a thread that had connected us, leaving me feeling both lighter and somehow unmoored. In the home office, I found a photo that made me pause. Richard and me at the opening of his first upscale restaurant, Montague's, named after a combination of our surnames. I was beaming with pride, my arm around his waist as he cut the ceremonial ribbon. That night, he'd toasted me in front of everyone, to my brilliant wife, without whom none of this would be possible. Seats. The restaurant had thrived, expanding into a group that now included 8 locations across 3 states. And I had been there for every step, reviewing contracts, helping with business plans, even suggesting the farm-to-table concept that had become their signature style. In many ways, the success of Richard's business was partly my achievement, too. I set the photo down, a new resolution forming. This divorce wouldn't just be about getting what I was legally entitled to. It would be about acknowledging my contributions to the life and business we had built together. Richard might have forgotten those contributions, but I would make sure the settlement reflected them. The next morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with Brittany, choosing a simple but expensive cream blouse and tailored pants, rather than my usual power suit. This wasn't a business meeting or a legal confrontation. It was something more complicated. I arrived at the Atrium Cafe 10 minutes early, selecting a quiet table in the corner with a view of the entrance. At precisely noon, a young woman walked in, glancing around nervously. She was stunning, tall, blonde, with the kind of effortless beauty that turned heads. She couldn't have been more than 22, exactly the age I had been when I met Richard. Our eyes met across the cafe, and I saw recognition flash in hers. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward me, her confidence seemingly returning with each step. "Alexandra?" she asked, her voice higher and softer than I had imagined. "Brittany," I acknowledged, gesturing to the seat across from me. "Please, sit down." She slid into the chair, fidgeting with the strap of her designer handbag, a recent Prada that I recognized from the collection Richard had bought me for Christmas. The same Christmas, he had apparently been cultivating a relationship with this girl. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, her eyes, a clear, bright blue, meeting mine directly. "I know this must be weird." "That's one word for it," I agreed, keeping my tone neutral. "You said there was something I should know about Richard." Brittany took a deep breath. "He's been lying to you, but he's been lying to me too." She opened her purse and removed a small stack of papers, placing them on the table between us. "He told me you two were already separated, that you had agreed to divorce months ago, but were keeping it quiet for business reasons." I felt a fresh wave of anger at Richard's manipulation, but kept my expression controlled. "When did this start? Between you two?" "6 months ago. I was hostessing at the Boston location during the opening. Richard was there for 2 weeks, overseeing everything." Her cheeks flushed slightly. "He was charming, attentive, made me feel special, said I had potential to move up in the company." The timeline aligned with the changes I'd noticed in Richard's behavior. "And you believed him? About us being separated?" She nodded, looking down at her hands. "He even showed me papers. What he said were preliminary divorce documents you'd both signed." She pushed the stack toward me. "These?" I picked them up, recognizing immediately that they were drafts of business contracts with signature pages from old documents attached. A crude forgery that would never have held up to legal scrutiny, but enough to convince someone who wanted to believe. "He brought me to New York 3 months ago," Brittany continued. "Set me up in an apartment, promised to help advance my modeling career." Her voice hardened slightly. "But then I started noticing things. He would never take me to certain restaurants, never introduced me to his close friends, always had excuses for why I couldn't visit his home. Because we were still very much married," I finished for her, setting the papers down. "And living together." She nodded, blinking back tears. "I found out the truth yesterday, after your text. I did some research, found articles about you and Richard together at events just months ago." She looked up at me, her expression a mix of anger and shame. "I feel so stupid." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She was young, manipulated by a man twice her age with wealth and power. "You're not the first woman Richard has charmed, and probably not the last. There are others? Besides me?" Her eyes widened in shock. I shook my head. "Not that I know of, but he charmed me the same way once, when I was about your age." Brittany's gaze sharpened with interest. "You were my age when you met him?" 20, I confirmed, signaling to the waiter for coffee. I hadn't planned on having a real conversation with this woman, but something about her directness made me reconsider. I was working as a receptionist at an advertising agency that handled his first restaurant's marketing. Richard was 31, already successful, confident, charming, Brittany finished, with a small, knowing smile. "Like, he's the only person in the room who really sees you." I nodded, surprised by how accurately she'd captured it. "Exactly like that." The waiter arrived with my coffee, and Brittany ordered an iced tea. When he left, she leaned forward. "So, what happened? How did you go from receptionist to—" She gestured vaguely at my designer watch, my tailored clothes, the obvious markers of success. "Richard happened, in part," I admitted. "He encouraged me to go back to school, paid for my undergraduate degree, supported me through law school. He was proud of my accomplishments." I stirred my coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. "At least, I thought he was." "He talked about you sometimes," Brittany said quietly. "Said you were brilliant, but that you'd grown cold, too focused on your career." The words stung, even coming from her. "And I suppose he presented himself as the neglected husband? She nodded, looking embarrassed. He said you two hadn't been intimate in over a year, that you were essentially roommates. She twisted the paper wrapper from her straw between her fingers. I'm guessing that wasn't true either. No, I said simply, leaving it at that. Some details of my marriage were still too private to share, especially with the woman who had been sleeping with my husband. Richard appears to have created convenient narratives for both of us. Our drinks arrived, creating a brief pause in the conversation. I used the moment to study Brittany more carefully. She was beautiful, yes, but there was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was more than the stereotype of a young model being kept by a wealthy older man. What do you want from this meeting, Brittany? I asked finally. You said you had something to tell me about Richard, but it seems you've mostly confirmed what I already suspected. She straightened, setting her drink aside. I have texts, emails, receipts, everything documenting our relationship for the past 6 months. I want you to have them. She reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive, placing it on the table. He lied to both of us, used both of us. I don't want him to get away with it. I stared at the small device, understanding its value in my divorce proceedings. With this evidence, there would be no way for Richard to deny the affair or contest the prenuptial clause. It was exactly what I needed, and yet I found myself hesitating. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Brittany's expression hardened. Because yesterday, after I confronted him about still being married to you, he told me I was just a fun distraction, and that I should be realistic about my position. Then he offered me money to disappear quietly. Her voice cracked slightly, like I was some problem to be handled, not a person he'd been telling he loved for months. The cold calculation sounded exactly like the Richard I'd seen in Goldstein's office. Not the man I thought I'd married, but the one he'd apparently become, or perhaps had always been, beneath the charm. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. You didn't deserve that. She shrugged, attempting nonchalance, but not quite succeeding. I'll be fine. I'm young, as he kept reminding me, but you and I both deserve better than his lies. She pushed the USB drive closer to me. Take it. Use it. Make him pay. I picked up the drive, turning it over in my fingers. Thank you. This will help significantly with my case. Good. She took a sip of her tea, then asked, What happens now? With the divorce, I mean. Now I negotiate from a position of strength, I explained, slipping the drive into my purse. With this evidence and the prenuptial agreement, Richard will have to agree to the terms I set forward. And those terms include half his business? Brittany asked, a hint of admiration in her voice. 50% of the business assets acquired during our marriage, I corrected, which includes the restaurant group, various real estate holdings, and several investment portfolios. She whistled softly. No wonder he looked terrified when I mentioned speaking to you. He stands to lose a fortune. He should have thought of that before he decided to cheat, I said, more sharply than I intended. I softened my tone. But this isn't about punishment. It's about getting what I legally deserve after 13 years of marriage and significant contributions to building those businesses. Brittany nodded, looking thoughtful. For what it's worth, I think you're handling this with a lot more class than most people would. She hesitated, then added, He showed me pictures of you sometimes, from events and parties. You always looked so confident, so put together. I was actually kind of intimidated by the idea of you. The comment startled a small laugh from me. Me? You're young and beautiful. If anyone should feel intimidated, it's me. Beauty fades, she said with surprising wisdom. But what you've built for yourself, your career, your reputation, that's real power. She gathered her purse, preparing to leave. I should go. I have a modeling go-see across town. What will you do now? I asked, genuinely curious about her plans. Move back to Boston, probably. My sister's there. Start over. She stood, smoothing her dress. Maybe go back to school. I always wanted to study design. You should, I encouraged, remembering my own journey. It's never too late to reinvent yourself. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. Thank you for meeting me, Alexandra. For what it's worth, I think Richard made a huge mistake letting you go. After she left, I sat alone with my coffee, processing the unexpected turn my morning had taken. I had come ready to face an adversary, perhaps even to unleash some of my anger on the woman who had been sleeping with my husband. Instead, I'd found another of Richard's victims. Different circumstances, but the same manipulation, the same lies. I returned to the office to find 3 messages from Martin Goldstein waiting for me. Apparently, Richard had instructed him to schedule another meeting, this time with a different approach. Instead of the insulting initial offer, Richard was now proposing something closer to an equal division of our personal assets, though still protecting his business interests. It wasn't enough, and both of them knew it. I called Goldstein back immediately. I've acquired additional evidence confirming Richard's infidelity. I informed him without preamble. Comprehensive documentation covering the past 6 months. I'm prepared to move forward with enforcing the prenuptial agreement in full, including the infidelity clause. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I see, Goldstein finally said, his tone resigned. Perhaps we should discuss potential settlement options before proceeding to court. I think that would be wise, I agreed. I'll have my terms drafted by tomorrow morning. That evening, I began the process of truly reclaiming my life. I transferred my personal items from the penthouse to a luxury short-term rental I'd arranged in a different part of the city. I needed neutral space, somewhere without memories of Richard in every corner. The new apartment was sleek and impersonal, exactly what I needed. After arranging my essential belongings, I sat at the pristine dining table with my laptop, drafting the settlement terms I would present to Goldstein. I worked methodically, ensuring every detail was precise, every claim justified by both the prenuptial agreement and state law. By midnight, I had completed the document. It was fair but firm, claiming exactly what I was entitled to, without vindictiveness, but also without compromise. I would get 50% of the restaurant group, half of our real estate holdings, and an equitable division of our personal property. Richard would retain enough to continue operating the business, but would need to include me as an equal partner in all future decisions affecting the company. As I prepared for bed in the unfamiliar apartment, I realized I felt something unexpected. Relief. The marriage I had built my adult life around was ending, but somehow I felt more like myself than I had in years. Without Richard's larger-than-life presence, without the constant adjustment to his needs and schedule, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly again. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, asset evaluations, and negotiations. Richard, faced with the irrefutable evidence of his affair and the binding language of the prenuptial agreement, had little choice but to accept my terms. Goldstein, to his credit, advised his client to settle rather than fight a losing battle in court. The actual signing of the divorce papers was anticlimactic. Richard and I sat across from each other in a conference room at Goldstein's firm, neither of us speaking beyond the necessary formalities. He looked tired. The confidence I had always associated with him diminished somehow. As we each signed our names to the document that would legally end our marriage, I caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Regret, perhaps, or simple resignation. When it was done, we stood to leave. At the door, Richard paused. Alexandra, just my name, spoken softly. I turned, meeting his eyes one last time. Yes, I'm sorry, he said, the words seeming to cost him something. Not for the divorce, that was probably inevitable, but for how I handled it. You deserved better. I studied him. This man I had loved for 13 years, trying to reconcile the charming young entrepreneur who had swept me off my feet with the calculating businessman who had tried to cheat me out of my fair share. And now this apparently contrite figure before me. Yes, I agreed simply. I did. As I walked out of the building into the bright spring afternoon, I felt as though I was stepping into a new chapter of my life. The divorce had been finalized, the assets divided, the legal battles concluded. Now came the harder part, figuring out who Alexandra Montgomery was on her own. The answer began to take shape in the months that followed. With my share of the restaurant group, I established myself as an active board member, bringing my legal expertise to bear on the company's expansion plans. Richard, initially resistant to my involvement, eventually came to value my input as the business continued to thrive despite our personal fallout. My career at the law firm flourished. Thomas offered me the opportunity to head a new division specializing in hospitality industry contracts, leveraging my experience with the restaurant business. The work was challenging and satisfying, allowing me to build something that was entirely my own achievement. On a personal level, I took time to rediscover interests I had neglected during my marriage. I joined a rowing club, something I'd enjoyed in my teens but had abandoned for lack of time. I took cooking classes, traveled to destinations Richard had never been interested in, and reconnected with friends I had lost touch with over the years. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected email from Brittany. She had returned to Boston as planned and had enrolled in design school. Attached to her message was a photo of her first completed project, a sleek, modern dress that showed genuine talent. "Thank you for the encouragement," she wrote. "Sometimes we need to be reminded of our own potential." I smiled as I typed my reply, genuinely happy for her new beginning. In a strange way, Richard's betrayal had liberated both of us, her from a relationship built on lies, and me from a marriage that had slowly but surely been diminishing who I was. That same week, I finalized the purchase of my own home. Not a penthouse in Richard's preferred neighborhood, but a brownstone in the West Village with character, history, and room to grow. As I arranged my belongings in the new space, I came across the photo that had once sat on my office desk, Richard and me on our 10th anniversary trip. I considered it for a moment, then placed it in a box destined for storage. Not thrown away, but no longer needed in my daily life. In its place, I set a new frame, a simple black and white photo of the Manhattan skyline at dawn, taken from the rowing club on a morning when I had risen early to watch the sun illuminate the city. It represented everything my life had become: independent, beautiful in its own right, full of possibility. 1 year to the day after Richard's devastating phone call, I attended the opening of the newest restaurant in the group, the first location I had helped develop from concept to completion. The space was stunning, with warm lighting, sustainable materials, and an innovative menu featuring local producers. Though Richard and I had worked on the project together professionally, we had maintained a careful distance personally, communicating primarily through management teams and legal channels. At the opening event, we found ourselves momentarily alone near the bar, away from the crowd of investors, critics, and industry insiders. Richard looked good. He had always known how to present himself, but there was a new wariness in his eyes when he looked at me. "Congratulations," he said, raising his glass slightly. "The critics are already raving. Your farm-to-table concept was exactly right." "Our concept," I corrected, giving credit where it was due. "Your culinary vision, my sustainability framework. We still make a good team professionally." He nodded, a flicker of something like wistfulness crossing his face. "Better business partners than spouses, apparently." "Perhaps," I agreed, then added more gently, "or perhaps just the wrong timing. The wrong circumstances. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met now, instead of when you were 20? He asked suddenly. "If we'd been equals from the start?" The question caught me off guard with its unexpected vulnerability. I considered it honestly before answering. "I think we might have had a chance. But we can't rewrite history, Richard." "No," he agreed, his gaze moving over the crowded restaurant, "our shared professional achievement, if not our shared life. But we can learn from it, at least." As he moved away to greet an arriving food critic, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. The pain had been real, the betrayal devastating. But from those ashes had risen something unexpected, a stronger, more authentic version of myself, a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. The young receptionist who had been dazzled by Richard's charm had grown into a formidable attorney who could stand her ground. The wife who had gradually lost herself in her husband's shadow had reclaimed her independent identity. The woman who had once defined herself primarily through her marriage now stood complete on her own. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the successful opening event, my assistant Sarah approached with a knowing smile. "There's a rather handsome investment banker at Table 9 who's been asking about you all evening. Thomas knows him from Harvard Law. Says he's one of the good ones." I laughed, shaking my head. "Not tonight, Sarah. Tonight is about celebrating this achievement." I gestured around the thriving restaurant. "But maybe next time. I think I might finally be ready." And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I realized it was true. The divorce that had once seemed like an ending had become instead a beginning. The start of a new chapter I was finally ready to write, on my own terms, with my own voice. The pain of betrayal would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was the strength I had found in its aftermath, the resilience that had transformed a devastating phone call into the catalyst for a more authentic life. Richard's attempt to discard me had ultimately set me free, a justice more poetic than any legal settlement could provide. The success of the new restaurant marked a turning point in my relationship with Richard, a shift from adversaries in a bitter divorce to cautious business partners with a complex history. Over the next 6 months, we settled into a professional rhythm that allowed the restaurant group to not only survive our personal upheaval, but actually thrive beyond expectations. Industry analysts who had predicted our divorce would devastate the business were proven wrong as our complementary skills, Richard's culinary vision and operational expertise, paired with my legal acumen and sustainability initiatives, created a more robust organization than either of us could have built alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very clause meant to punish infidelity had inadvertently created a business partnership that was proving remarkably successful. The Montgomery Restaurant Group's stock has climbed 15% since the restructuring, Thomas remarked one afternoon, dropping the Wall Street Journal on my desk as he entered my office. "Apparently, divorce agrees with your business sense." I smiled, skimming the article that highlighted our expanding farm-to-table concept and the group's recent sustainability award. Who would have thought forced partnership would work out so well? Thomas settled into the chair across from my desk, studying me with the perceptive gaze that had made him such a formidable attorney. "And personally, how are you doing with all of this? It can't be easy working alongside him." I considered the question carefully. "It's educational," I finally said. "Seeing Richard in a purely professional context has been revealing. He's brilliant at what he does. I always knew that. But I'm also seeing the limitations I was blind to during our marriage." "Limitations?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "His resistance to innovation, unless it's his idea. His tendency to charm, rather than collaborate when faced with opposition." I shrugged. Things I used to compensate for automatically as his wife, but now addressed directly as his business partner. "And he's accepting that direct approach? He doesn't have much choice," I said with a small smile. "The board supports my initiatives, especially after the success of the Brooklyn location." Thomas chuckled. "Alexandra Montgomery, corporate powerhouse. A far cry from the nervous first-year associate I hired 8 years ago." "I was never nervous," I protested. "You were terrified," he corrected good-naturedly. "But determined. That's why I took a chance on you." He stood, straightening his jacket. "Speaking of taking chances, the firm's anniversary gala is next Friday. You should bring someone." I gave him a pointed look. "Subtle matchmaking doesn't suit you, Thomas." "Who said anything about matchmaking? I'm simply suggesting you might enjoy having company, besides a table of boring old attorneys." He paused at the door. Although James Harrington did specifically ask if you would be attending. The antitrust specialist from Harrison & Wade? I tried to sound casual, though the name had caught my attention. I'd met James at a legal conference 3 months earlier and had been impressed by his insightful questions during my panel on contract negotiation. We'd spoken briefly at the reception afterward, a conversation that had left me intrigued but cautious. The very same. Brilliant lawyer, divorced 4 years, no children, marathon runner, and rumor has it, he does pro bono work for environmental causes. Thomas's expression was innocent, but his eyes twinkled. Not that I'm suggesting anything. Safe. After he left, I found myself considering the possibility. In the 15 months since my divorce, I had deliberately avoided dating, focusing instead on rebuilding my life independently. There had been a few casual dinners with men Thomas or other friends had introduced me to, but I'd kept everyone at a careful distance, not yet ready to risk emotional involvement. But lately, I'd begun to feel something shifting inside me, a readiness to at least consider opening that door again. Not to replace what I had lost, but to discover what new connections might be possible now that I knew myself more fully. I picked up my phone and scrolled to James's contact information, saved after we'd exchanged business cards at the conference. Before I could overthink it, I typed a simple message. I hear you'll be at the Jenkins and Montgomery Anniversary Gala next Friday. Perhaps we could continue our discussion on antitrust implications in sustainable business practices. His response came less than 5 minutes later. I'd be delighted. I've been following your work with the restaurant group's supplier network. Impressive model for the industry. Save me a dance? I found myself smiling at the subtle blend of professional respect and personal interest. One dance, I texted back, and only if you're prepared to debate the merits of vertical integration while doing so. Challenge accepted, came his swift reply. That evening, as I prepared dinner in my brownstone kitchen, a space I had redesigned to suit my own tastes with high-end appliances and a herb garden in the window, I realized I was humming. The simple act of making plans that were solely for my own enjoyment felt like another small victory in my journey toward rebuilding. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Richard's name flashed on the screen, unusual for a Friday evening when our interactions were typically limited to scheduled meetings and necessary emails. Richard, I answered, keeping my tone neutral. Is everything all right? Alexandra? His voice sounded strained. I apologize for calling outside business hours, but we have a situation with the Chicago location. The head chef is threatening to leave, taking his team with him. I set down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables, giving him my full attention. Marcus, why? He seemed completely on board with the expansion plans at the last meeting. He was, until he received a very generous offer from Ellington Group. Richard named our largest competitor, a restaurant conglomerate known for aggressive tactics. They're opening a new concept 3 blocks from our location and want Marcus to head it. That's not a coincidence, I said, my legal mind already analyzing the implications. How did they know about our Chicago plans in such detail? We haven't even announced the specific menu concept publicly. Exactly my concern, Richard replied. I think we have a leak, possibly at the board level. The seriousness of the situation was clear. The Chicago expansion was the centerpiece of our growth strategy for the coming year, with millions already invested in the location and concept development. Losing Marcus, with his Michelin star reputation and loyal team, would be a significant blow. I need to fly to Chicago tomorrow, Richard continued. Try to convince Marcus to stay, but I could use your help with this. My help? I repeated, surprised by the request. While we'd established a functional working relationship, Richard rarely sought my direct involvement in operational issues. You have a way with contracts, he said, a hint of his old charm creeping into his voice. And you understand the legal implications if Ellington is using insider information. Plus, Marcus respects you. He was impressed with your commitment to sustainable sourcing. I hesitated, mentally reviewing my weekend plans, primarily catching up on case files and meeting a friend for brunch on Sunday. Nothing that couldn't be rescheduled. "I'll come," I decided. "Text me the flight details. I'll review Marcus's contract tonight and see what leverage we have." "Thank you," Richard said, the relief in his voice palpable. "I've already asked Diane to book you on the same flight, 9 a.m. from LaGuardia." After we hung up, I stood motionless in my kitchen for a moment, processing the unexpected turn of events. A business trip with Richard, our first since the divorce. The prospect was both professionally necessary and personally complicated. The next morning found us sitting side by side in first class, reviewing strategy as the plane prepared for takeoff. Richard was impeccably dressed as always, but I noticed the subtle signs of stress, the slight tension around his eyes, the way he repeatedly checked his watch. "Marcus has another year on his contract," I noted, scanning the document on my tablet. "But these non-compete clauses aren't as robust as they should be. If he's determined to leave, he could challenge them, especially with Ellington's resources behind him." Richard nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Legal enforcement would take time we don't have. We need to convince him to stay willingly. What's Ellington offering him?" According to my source, double his current salary, creative control, and a 5% equity stake in the new venture. I whistled softly. "Aggressive. They really want him. Or they really want to hurt us," Richard countered. "This feels personal, Alexandra." I glanced at him sharply. "Personal how?" He hesitated, then said carefully, "There have been rumors that Harold Ellington has been interested in acquiring our group for years. When the news of our divorce went public, he might have seen it as an opportunity to destabilize us before making an offer. The possibility made strategic sense, though it left a sour taste in my mouth. So our personal failings become business vulnerabilities. Our personal situation," Richard corrected, his eyes meeting mine. "Not necessarily a failing." The comment surprised me, as did the lack of bitterness in his tone. Before I could respond, the flight attendant approached with pre-takeoff drinks, creating a natural break in the conversation. We spent the remainder of the flight discussing potential incentives to keep Marcus, carefully avoiding any further personal observations. By the time we landed in Chicago, we had outlined a comprehensive counteroffer that would match Ellington's financial terms while providing Marcus with unique opportunities our competitor couldn't offer. The Four Seasons Chicago concierge greeted us as Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery when we checked in, a mistake I had encountered several times since the divorce. Usually, I corrected it immediately, but this time Richard spoke first. "2 separate rooms, please. Ms. Montgomery and Mr. Montgomery." His tone was polite but firm, and I felt oddly grateful for his quick clarification. "Of course, sir. My apologies," the concierge responded smoothly. "We have your reservations right here, adjoining suites on the executive floor, as requested." I raised an eyebrow at Richard as we walked toward the elevators. "Adjoining suites?" He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Diane made the arrangements before I could review them. I can request a change if you'd prefer." "It's fine," I said, surprised to find that it actually was. "We're here for business, and it will be convenient for reviewing materials." Our meeting with Marcus was scheduled for 7 that evening, at the restaurant's Chicago location, an elegant space overlooking the river that we had acquired 3 years earlier. As we entered through the back entrance, the familiar sounds and smells of a high-end kitchen in full service brought back memories of countless restaurant openings I had attended at Richard's side during our marriage. Richard placed his hand lightly on my lower back as we navigated through the busy kitchen, an unconscious gesture from our years together. I stiffened slightly, and he immediately removed it, murmuring an apology. The moment was brief, but served as a pointed reminder of the complex history between us. Marcus greeted us in his office, his usual exuberant personality subdued. At 40, with a reputation as one of the most innovative chefs in the Midwest, he had been a significant coup for our restaurant group, when Richard had recruited him 2 years earlier. "I assume you know why we're here," Richard began without preamble once we were seated. Marcus nodded, his expression guarded. "Harold Ellington called me personally, made quite an offer." "We've heard the details," I said, keeping my tone conversational rather than accusatory. "It's certainly generous, though I'm curious how Ellington knew so much about our expansion plans for this location." A flicker of discomfort crossed Marcus's face. "I didn't breach any confidentiality, if that's what you're suggesting." "Not at all," I assured him. "But someone did. The timing and specificity of their offer suggest they had inside information, which concerns us on multiple levels." Richard leaned forward. "Marcus, we're not here to guilt you into staying. You're an exceptional chef, and if Ellington's offer represents the opportunity you want, we'll respect that, even as we deal with the contractual implications." Marcus looked surprised at this approach. He had clearly expected a hard sell or legal threats. "But," I continued, "before you make your decision, we'd like to share our vision for your role in the group's future, a vision that includes opportunities we believe Ellington can't match." Over the next hour, Richard and I laid out our counter-offer: a matching salary increase, a larger equity stake in the Chicago location specifically, and, this was Richard's masterstroke, the opportunity to develop a chef's training program bearing Marcus's name, with locations in Chicago, New York, and eventually Los Angeles. "Your own legacy," Richard explained passionately. "Not just restaurants that might change concepts with market trends, but an institution that develops the next generation of culinary talent." I watched Marcus's expression shift as he considered the proposal. "The training program was actually Alexandra's idea," Richard added, surprising me with the acknowledgement. "She pointed out that your mentorship of younger chefs has always been one of your greatest strengths." Marcus turned to me, curiosity evident in his expression. "You noticed that?" "During my last visit," I confirmed. "I saw how you worked with your sous chefs, teaching, not just directing. It's a rare quality in kitchens at this level." A small smile tugged at his lips. "My first chef was a tyrant. I swore I'd never create that kind of toxic environment in my own kitchen." He leaned back, considering us both. "I have to say, I wasn't expecting this approach. Given everything that's happened between you two, I thought the company might be vulnerable." Richard and I exchanged a quick glance. "Our personal situation has changed," I acknowledged, "but our commitment to the business, and to the people who make it successful, hasn't." "If anything," Richard added, "the restructuring has strengthened our strategic capabilities. Alexandra's more direct involvement has brought perspectives I was missing." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. It was perhaps the first time since our divorce that Richard had openly acknowledged the value of my contributions without any hint of resentment. By the time we concluded the meeting 2 hours later, Marcus had verbally committed to staying, contingent only on reviewing the formal contract revision I promised to have drafted by Monday. We had not only averted the immediate crisis, but potentially strengthened our relationship with a key team member. "That went better than I expected," Richard admitted as we walked back to the hotel through the cool Chicago evening. The city lights reflected off the river beside us, creating a peaceful backdrop to what had been an intense day. "The training program was inspired," I said. "You knew exactly what would appeal to his desire for legacy beyond just cooking." "We make a good team," Richard observed quietly. "Professionally speaking." The comment hung between us, loaded with unspoken history. After a moment, I responded with equal care. "We always did work well together. That wasn't our problem." "No," he agreed, his pace slowing slightly. "Our problem was that I forgot to see you, really see you, as you grew into the remarkable woman you've become. I got comfortable with the idea of the young wife I could impress, mentor, show off. When you became my equal, my superior in many ways, I didn't know how to adjust." The unexpected candor left me momentarily speechless. We had never discussed the real reasons behind our marriage's collapse. not even during the divorce proceedings. That's surprisingly insightful, I finally managed. Richard smiled ruefully. 15 months of weekly therapy will do that. Another suggestion from Marcus, actually, after he noticed I was micromanaging out of insecurity, as he put it. You've been in therapy? I couldn't hide my surprise. Richard had always dismissed psychological support as unnecessary for people with self-discipline. Since about 2 months after the divorce was finalized, he confirmed, it seemed prudent, given how spectacularly I'd managed to sabotage both my marriage and nearly my business. We had reached the hotel entrance. As the doorman welcomed us, I found myself studying Richard with new eyes, seeing not just the ex-husband who had betrayed me, but a more complex figure attempting his own form of reconstruction. Would you like to get a drink? He asked suddenly. In the hotel bar? Just to continue our discussion about next steps with the Chicago situation. I hesitated, various caution flags rising in my mind. A drink with Richard, in a dimly lit hotel bar, after a day of surprisingly effective collaboration? It felt like dangerous territory. I should review those contract clauses we discussed, I said, the excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. Richard nodded, accepting the deflection gracefully. Of course, it's been a long day. As we rode the elevator in silence, I found myself wondering if I was being unnecessarily cautious or sensibly prudent. The Richard beside me seemed genuinely changed from the man who had coldly ended our marriage over the phone. But trust, once broken, wasn't easily reconstructed, especially not when the stakes included my carefully rebuilt emotional independence. When the elevator reached our floor, Richard stepped out first, then turned to face me. Thank you for coming to Chicago, Alexandra. We wouldn't have kept Marcus without you. It was the right business decision, I said simply. Yes, he agreed. But still, thank you. He hesitated, then added quietly, Good night, Alexandra. Good night, Richard, I replied, watching as he walked down the corridor to his suite. Alone in my room, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a mineral water from the minibar, settling onto the window seat with its panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. My phone buzzed with a text from James Harrington. Looking forward to that dance next Friday. Just brushing up on my vertical integration arguments. Seats, I smiled at the message, appreciating its light tone and the uncomplicated interest it represented. Typing a brief, friendly response, I found myself reflecting on the contrast between the straightforward potential of something new and the weighted complexity of my history with Richard. Outside my window, Chicago glittered with possibility, much like my life 15 months after divorce, full of unexpected directions, new challenges, and the hard-won freedom to choose my own path forward. Whatever that path might include, I was finally confident in my ability to navigate it on my terms, with clear eyes and an open heart. The following Friday evening found me standing before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, assessing my appearance with a critical eye. The emerald silk gown I'd chosen for the firm's anniversary gala highlighted my eyes and fell in elegant lines to the floor. My hair was swept up in a sophisticated twist, a few carefully arranged tendrils framing my face. The overall effect was polished, confident, and, I had to admit, quite beautiful. As I fastened my grandmother's diamond earrings, I reflected on how much had changed since the last time I'd attended a formal event. Then, I had been Richard Montgomery's wife, part of a power couple known throughout New York's business and social circles. Tonight, I would attend as Alexandra Montgomery, named partner at Jenkins and Montgomery, respected attorney and woman in her own right. The thought brought not sadness, but a quiet satisfaction. The journey from devastation to independence had been challenging, but standing here now, I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't trade my hard-won freedom for the security of my former life. My phone chimed with a text from the car service announcing their arrival. With one final glance in the mirror, I gathered my clutch and wrap, ready to embrace whatever the evening might bring. The gala was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of New York's most prestigious venues and a favorite of Thomas's. As I ascended the grand staircase, the sounds of a string quartet and the gentle hum of conversation drifted out to greet me. Inside, the great hall had been transformed into an elegant reception space, with soft lighting highlighting the historic architecture and floral arrangements in the firm's colors adorning the tables. "Alexandra!" Thomas's voice carried across the entrance. He approached with his wife Eleanor beside him, both beaming with pride at the success of the event. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I smiled, accepting Eleanor's warm hug. "The venue is spectacular, Thomas. You've outdone yourself this year. 30 years deserves something special," he replied, glancing around with satisfaction, though I suspect most of these younger associates are more excited about the open bar than the architectural significance. Eleanor laughed, linking her arm through her husband's. "Let them enjoy it. Some of them might be celebrating a milestone anniversary of their own someday." She gave me a meaningful look. "Speaking of celebrations, I believe someone has been watching the entrance rather attentively since we arrived." Following her gaze, I spotted James Harrington across the room, engaged in conversation with a senior partner from his firm, but glancing periodically toward the entrance. As if sensing my attention, he looked up, our eyes meeting across the crowded space. He smiled, a warm, genuine expression that created an unexpected flutter in my chest. "Go on," Eleanor encouraged with a gentle nudge. "That man has been asking Thomas about you for months. He deserves at least one dance for his persistence." As I made my way across the room, greeting colleagues and clients, I was acutely aware of James tracking my progress. Unlike Richard, who had always commanded attention when we entered a room together, James waited patiently, allowing me to navigate the social currents at my own pace. "Alexandra Montgomery," he said when I finally reached him, his voice carrying a note of appreciation that went beyond mere politeness. "You look absolutely breathtaking." "James," I acknowledged with a smile, "thank you for the compliment, and for your patience. Some things are worth waiting for," he replied simply. Up close, he was even more attractive than I remembered, tall and distinguished with intelligent gray eyes and smile lines that suggested a man who laughed often. "Would you care for a drink? Or perhaps that dance we discussed?" "A dance first, I think," I decided, surprising myself with the directness. "Before the floor gets too crowded." He offered his arm, leading me toward the area where other couples had begun moving to the quartet's rendition of a classic jazz standard. As we took our position, his hand settling respectfully at my waist, I found myself appreciating the comfortable distance he maintained, close enough for the dance, but careful not to presume. "So," he began as we moved in perfect rhythm, "vertical integration in sustainable supply chains, as promised." I laughed, relaxing into the easy grace of our movement together. "I'm impressed you remembered the exact topic." "I remember everything about our conversation at the conference," he admitted, "including your compelling argument against monopolistic supplier contracts in the restaurant industry." "Hardly typical cocktail party conversation," I noted, "which is precisely why it was memorable." His eyes held mine as we turned. "That, and the fact that you demolished Raymond Porter's counter-argument so thoroughly, he actually apologized for wasting your time." The memory made me smile. Porter was a notoriously difficult opposing counsel who rarely conceded any point. He deserved it. His position was legally indefensible and ethically questionable. And yet, you managed to correct him without humiliating him. A skill many litigators never master. James guided me smoothly through a turn. "It's one of the things I've admired about your approach since I first observed your work 3 years ago." "You've been following my cases?" I asked, surprised. "The Andrews merger, the Westbrook intellectual property dispute, and most recently, your rather impressive restructuring of the Montgomery Restaurant Group." He named 3 of my most significant professional achievements with casual accuracy. I make it a point to study excellence when I encounter it. The compliment delivered without flattery but as simple fact, warmed me more than any elaborate praise might have. "And what have you concluded from this study?" I asked, curious about his assessment. "That you're not only brilliant, but principled in an industry where that's increasingly rare." His hand tightened slightly at my waist as he guided me away from another couple. "And that whoever let you go made the greatest mistake of his life." The statement hung between us for a moment, more intimate than our physical proximity. "That's quite a definitive judgment from someone who doesn't know the full story," I said carefully. "Perhaps," James acknowledged, "but I'm an excellent judge of character. It's what makes me good at what I do." Before I could respond, the music transitioned to a new piece, and a familiar voice spoke from beside us. "May I cut in?" Richard stood there, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, his expression unreadable as he looked between James and me. The unexpectedness of his presence left me momentarily speechless. James recovered first, his hand dropping politely from my waist. "Of course, though the lady may have other ideas." Both men turned to me, waiting for my decision. A dozen questions raced through my mind. What was Richard doing here? How had he known about the gala? Why would he appear now, just as I was beginning to explore something new? "One dance," I said finally, more to Richard than to James. "For business courtesy." James nodded, lifting my hand briefly to his lips in a gesture that managed to be both old-fashioned and genuinely charming. "I'll get us those drinks. Find me when you're ready." As he walked away, Richard took his place, keeping a more formal distance between us than James had. "I'm sorry for the interruption," he said, as we began to move to the music. "That wasn't my intention." "What was your intention, Richard?" I asked directly. "This is my firm's anniversary gala. You weren't invited." "Actually, I was." He nodded toward the far side of the room, where the chairman of our biggest corporate client stood chatting with Thomas. "Robert Chandler asked me to accompany him. I didn't realize you would be here until we arrived." The explanation was plausible. Chandler Global was both a major client of our firm and a significant investor in the restaurant group, but something in Richard's expression suggested there was more to the story. "You could have declined once you saw me," I pointed out. "I considered it," he admitted. "But then I saw you dancing with Harrington, and He hesitated. "I was curious." "About James?" "About seeing you with someone else." His honesty was unexpected. "It's been 15 months since the divorce. I knew intellectually that you would eventually move on, but seeing it is different." I studied him, trying to understand his motivation. "Are you jealous, Richard? Because you lost that right when you decided a 22-year-old was more appealing than your wife." He winced at the directness. "I deserve that. And no, I don't have any right to jealousy. But I would be lying if I said it was easy to see you looking so beautiful, so confident, with someone who clearly appreciates who you are." The music carried us around a turn, and I used the moment to gather my thoughts. "What do you want from me, Richard? We've established a working relationship. The business is thriving. Why complicate things?" "Because I've been doing a lot of thinking since Chicago," he said, his voice lowering, "about what went wrong between us, about the man I was, the man I want to be now." "Therapy seems to be working for you," I observed, trying to keep my tone light despite the heaviness of the conversation. "It is," he acknowledged, "but seeing you with Harrington just now made me realize something my therapist has been trying to tell me for months. I never truly saw you, Alexandra, not as you deserved to be seen." I faltered slightly in our dance, thrown by his candor. Richard steadied me with a gentle pressure at my waist, continuing as though he hadn't noticed my reaction. "When we met, you were this beautiful, bright young woman who looked at me like I hung the moon. It was intoxicating to be admired that way. But as you grew, as you became the remarkable woman you are now, I felt threatened instead of proud. That's on me, not you." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, genuinely puzzled by his timing. "Because I wanted you to know that I understand what I lost," he said simply. "Not just a wife, but a partner who challenged me, who made me better when I was willing to listen. He smiled ruefully. It took losing everything to make me see that. Across the room, I caught sight of James at the bar, deliberately giving us space, but clearly waiting for my return. The contrast between the two men, between my past and a possible future, couldn't have been more striking. "I appreciate your honesty," I said carefully, "and I'm glad you're finding clarity through therapy. But Richard, whatever you're hoping for here, I'm not hoping for anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for reconciliation or forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see you now, truly see you, even if it's too late." The music drew to a close, and Richard stepped back, releasing me from our dance. "Thank you for the dance, Alexandra, and for everything you've taught me, even when it was painful for both of us." He glanced toward James. "He seems like a good man. I hope he appreciates how fortunate he is." Before I could respond, Richard turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with the same unexpected suddenness with which he had appeared. I stood motionless for a moment, processing the exchange, before making my way back to where James waited. "Everything all right?" he asked, as he handed me a glass of champagne, his expression concerned but not prying. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Just an unexpected conversation." "With your ex-husband," he noted, not a question but a gentle acknowledgement. I looked at him in surprise. "You recognized him?" "I make it a point to know who the major players are in any room," James said with a small smile. Richard Montgomery's reputation precedes him, both professionally and personally. The implication was clear. He knew who Richard was to me, had probably known from the beginning. "And that doesn't concern you?" I asked, curious about his perspective. James considered the question with the thoughtfulness I was coming to associate with him. "Everyone has a past, Alexandra. What matters to me is the present, and possibly the future, if you're interested in exploring that." His directness was refreshing after Richard's complicated layers of meaning. "I might be," I admitted, taking a sip of champagne, "though I should warn you, I'm still finding my footing as just Alexandra, not one half of Richard and Alexandra." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he assured me. "The woman who emerged from that marriage is extraordinary in her own right. That's who I'm interested in knowing better." The evening progressed with surprising ease after that. James and I danced again, shared stories over dinner, and found ourselves deep in conversation about everything from legal theory to favorite childhood books. Unlike my early days with Richard, where I had often felt like I was trying to keep up with his world, with James the exchange felt balanced. Two equals sharing perspectives, challenging each other's thinking, and genuinely enjoying the process. By the time he walked me to my car at the end of the night, something had shifted in my perception of what might be possible in this new chapter of my life. At the car door, James paused, his expression thoughtful. "I've enjoyed tonight immensely," he said, his voice warm in the cool night air. "Would you consider dinner next weekend? There's a new exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art I thought you might enjoy beforehand." The invitation was clear, intentional, a proper date rather than the professional adjacent interaction we'd shared tonight. I found myself nodding before I had fully processed my answer. "I'd like that," I said, realizing with some surprise that I truly meant it. His smile deepened, revealing a dimple in his left cheek I hadn't noticed before. "Wonderful. I'll call you to arrange the details." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek, respectful, but with a hint of something more. "Good night, Alexandra." As my car pulled away, I watched his figure recede in the rear window, a curious lightness spreading through me. Not the dizzying infatuation I had felt with Richard at 20, but something more grounded, the quiet pleasure of connecting with someone who saw me clearly and valued what he saw. Back in my brownstone, I moved through my evening routine with thoughts still swirling around the unexpected encounters of the night. Richard's appearance had been jarring, but strangely cathartic. There was a sense of closure in his acknowledgement, a final period at the end of our shared sentence. And James, the possibility represented by our connection, felt like a first word on a fresh page, tentative but full of potential. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a message from James. "Thank you for a memorable evening. Looking forward to continuing our conversation about the Sherman Antitrust Act and your controversial position on jazz fusion." Not necessarily in that order. I smiled at the reference to our spirited debate over dinner, appreciating his ability to balance intellectual engagement with gentle humor. Typing a brief reply, I set my phone aside and turned out the light, settling into the peaceful darkness of my room. 2 years ago, I had been Alexandra Montgomery, wife of successful restaurateur Richard Montgomery, a woman whose identity was inextricably linked to her husband's. When that identity had been shattered by betrayal, I had feared I might never fully recover what had been lost. But lying there in the quiet of my own home, reflecting on the woman I had become, I realized that I hadn't merely recovered, I had discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed, ambitions that were uniquely mine, and a capacity for resilience that had transformed pain into growth. The divorce that had once seemed like an ending had instead become a doorway to a life more authentically mine than any I had imagined possible. Richard's cruel phone call, intended to dismiss me from his life, had inadvertently set me free to create something far more valuable. A life built on my own terms, governed by my own choices, and open to possibilities I was only beginning to explore. The irony wasn't lost on me as I drifted toward sleep. The prenuptial agreement Richard had insisted upon to protect himself from a young wife's potential betrayal had become the instrument of justice when he was the one who strayed. The legal expertise he had encouraged me to develop had given me the tools to claim what was rightfully mine. The confidence he had once admired had grown into an independence he could no longer control. 6 months later, as I stood at the podium accepting the American Bar Association's prestigious Women-in-Law Award for my work developing sustainable contract models for the hospitality industry, I caught sight of 2 significant figures in the audience. Richard sat near the back, his presence a respectful acknowledgement of my achievement rather than any claim to it. And in the front row, James watched with genuine pride, his support a steady companion to my continued growth rather than a definition of it. My acceptance speech touched on the journey that had brought me to this moment, not the personal details that remained private, but the professional evolution that had emerged from personal transformation. Sometimes, I told the gathered attorneys, judges, and legal scholars, our greatest contributions come not from following established patterns, but from the courage to forge new ones. Whether in contract law or in life, the most meaningful structures are those we build with intention, integrity, and a willingness to begin again when necessary. Later that evening, at the small celebration dinner James had arranged with close friends and colleagues, Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To Alexandra Montgomery," he said, his eyes twinkling with the pride of a mentor who had watched his protégé exceed every expectation, who reminded all of us that the finest legal minds are those that understand both the letter of the law and the human heart behind it. As glasses clinked around the table, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey, difficult as it had been at times, that had led me here. The phone call that had once devastated me had become merely the first line in a story I continued to write, one choice at a time, with wisdom hard-won and possibilities limitless. The young receptionist, who had once been dazzled by a successful older man, had become a woman who knew her own worth. The betrayed wife, who had confronted her husband's attorney with trembling determination, had become a respected legal mind who made others tremble with the precision of her arguments. The woman who had once defined herself through her marriage had discovered that her true self had been waiting all along, ready to emerge stronger, wiser, and infinitely more complete. And as I looked around at the life I had built from the ashes of betrayal, the career that fulfilled me, the home I had created, the relationships that nourished me, and the open road of possibilities ahead, I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had brought me here, not even the devastating phone call that had started it all. For in that moment of greatest pain had been born my greatest freedom, the chance to discover who Alexandra Montgomery truly was, and the courage to become her fully, without apology or compromise. Sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of a better one. And this story, my story, was still being written one day at a time, with a pen firmly in my own hand, and a future limited only by the scope of my own imagination. The young woman who had once signed a prenuptial agreement without understanding its implications had become an attorney who knew exactly what she was worth, in the courtroom, in business, and in life. And that, perhaps, was the most poetic justice of all.